I'm sitting in a Boston courtroom watching my son try to have me declared mentally incompetent. His name is Garrett. He's 40 years old, wearing a suit I don't recognize, and he won't look at me. Not once. He came in with that smile, the one that says he's already won, flanked by a lawyer whose briefcase probably costs more than my monthly rent. I raised him alone after his father died. I worked double shifts at the diner, scrubbed hospital floors on weekends, and gave him everything I could. I taught him to say grace before meals, to help neighbors without being asked, to understand that wealth isn't measured in what you own, but in what you give. But somewhere along the way, Garrett changed, or maybe he just showed me who he'd always been. 3 weeks ago, I received a manila envelope. Inside was a petition claiming I had dementia, that I was a danger to myself, that I needed someone, him, to make decisions for me. Medical reports from doctors I'd never seen. Witness statements from people I didn't know. All of it perfectly fabricated, thoroughly planned. He wants to be my guardian. He wants control of my assets. There's just one problem. I don't have any. 3 years ago, when Garrett started coming around more often, not to visit, but to ask questions about my finances, about the house I owned, about what I had set aside, I knew. I saw it in his eyes. I heard it in the way he talked about money, about what I owed him. So I made a choice. I sold my house in South Boston, the 3-bedroom colonial I'd bought with my husband's life insurance money in 1987, the one where I raised Garrett, where I hung Christmas lights every December and planted tomatoes every spring. I closed out my savings accounts, and I gave it all away to St. Mary's Home for the Elderly, to the Greater Boston Food Bank, to families in my parish who were drowning in medical bills and couldn't make rent. I kept enough to live on, enough for my 1-bedroom walk-up in Dorchester, my groceries, my medications, nothing more. Because I realized something. My son doesn't love me. He loves what he thinks I have, and I'd rather die with nothing than let him profit from my existence. Now I'm watching the judge, a stern woman named Callahan, with steel-gray hair and eyes that miss nothing, read through Garrett's petition. She's frowning, flipping pages. Her expression darkens with each line. "Mr. Doyle," she says slowly, looking up at my son. "You're asking for control of your mother's assets, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Garrett answers smoothly. "For her own protection." "I see." Judge Callahan picks up another document. "And according to the financial disclosure filed with this petition, what assets does your mother currently have?" Garrett hesitates, just for a second, but I see it. She has the house in South Boston, some savings, investments. "No," the judge interrupts. "She doesn't." The courtroom goes silent. "According to these records," Judge Callahan continues, her voice sharp as a blade, "Mrs. Doyle sold her property 3 years ago. She has no significant bank accounts, no investments, no valuable assets. She rents an apartment and lives on Social Security. So, I'll ask you again, Mr. Doyle. What exactly are you trying to control?" Garrett's face drains of color. His lawyer starts whispering urgently, but my son just stares at the judge, his mouth opening and closing like he can't find words. That's when I stand. "Your Honor," I say, my voice steady and clear. "May I speak?" She nods, and I tell her everything about how I watched my son transform, from the boy I raised into a man who looked at his own mother and saw dollar signs, about the choice I made to give away everything I'd worked for, rather than let him turn me into a transaction, about how freedom isn't having things, it's not needing them. I tell her I gave it all away so that when I die, he won't have anything to fight over, nothing to regret except the time he wasted, treating me like a bank account instead of a human being. Garrett's face twists with rage and humiliation. His lawyer tries to argue that my actions prove I'm incompetent, that no rational person would give away their life savings. But Judge Callahan leans forward, and her voice could cut steel. That sounds perfectly rational to me. She dismisses the petition, declares me fully competent, tells Garrett he's lucky she's not sanctioning him for filing a frivolous case. My son stands abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "This is bullshit," he hisses. "She's manipulating everyone." "One more word," Judge Callahan warns, "and I'll hold you in contempt. Now sit down or leave my courtroom." For a second, I think he might explode right there. But his lawyer grabs his arm and Garrett goes pale. Then he turns and walks out. No goodbye, no apology, just gone. And I'm left standing in that courtroom, 68 years old, with nothing to my name but the clothes on my back and a peace I haven't felt in years. Outside, the March air hits me like a slap. I stand on the courthouse steps and look out at Boston, old and new, elegant and gritty, full of people just trying to get through another day. Somewhere out there, Garrett is probably drowning his humiliation in whiskey and blame. Somewhere out there, families I've never met are sleeping in warm beds and eating meals because my money helped them survive. I didn't win today. Not really. Because winning would mean getting my son back, the one I remember, before greed twisted him into someone I don't recognize. But I did something else. I let go. And in that letting go, I found something I thought I'd lost forever. Freedom. The kind that comes from trusting you'll be okay even when everything falls apart. From believing that mercy matters more than vengeance. From knowing that the only wealth that matters is what you give away. I walk toward the subway, my coat pulled tight against the cold. Tomorrow I'll wake up in my small apartment and make breakfast and live my quiet, ordinary life. And if Garrett ever calls with real remorse, with genuine change in his heart, I'll forgive him, because that's what grace looks like. But I won't wait for it. I've already spent too many years doing that. Now, finally, I'm free, and free is enough. The letter came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was the day I did laundry at the coin-op down on Dorchester Avenue, the one with the flickering fluorescent lights, and the smell of detergent so strong, it made my eyes water. I'd been living in that neighborhood for 3 years now, ever since I sold the house in Southie, the one I'd bought with my late husband's life insurance money back in 1987, the one where I'd raised Garrett, where I'd hung Christmas lights every December and planted tomatoes in the backyard every spring. The apartment I rented now was nothing special. A one-bedroom walk-up above a Vietnamese restaurant, with thin walls and a radiator that clanked all winter. But it was mine. Or at least, I paid for it myself. I was folding towels when Mrs. Nguyen from downstairs knocked on my door, holding a manila envelope. "This come for you, Mrs. Doyle," she said in her careful English, her dark eyes full of concern. "Look important." I thanked her and took it inside. My hands shook a little as I tore it open, not because I was afraid, but because some part of me already knew. The return address was from a law office in downtown Boston, Keller and Associates. I didn't recognize the name. Inside was a petition, a legal document, full of words that felt like punches. Mentally incompetent, unable to manage affairs, requires guardianship. And at the bottom, in neat black ink, Garrett Michael Doyle, petitioner. My son wanted to take control of my life. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one I'd bought at a yard sale 15 years ago, and read the whole thing twice. He was claiming I had dementia, that I was a danger to myself, that I needed someone, him, to make decisions for me. There were attachments, reports from doctors I'd never seen, statements from people I didn't know, all saying I was confused, forgetful, unable to function. It was so perfectly constructed, so thoroughly planned, that for a moment I almost admired the effort he'd put into it. Almost. I set the papers down and looked out the window. March in Boston is a cruel month. Not quite winter, not quite spring. just gray and cold and waiting. The street below was busy with the afternoon rush. Cars honking, people hurrying home from work, the smell of pho drifting up from the restaurant. Life going on, indifferent to the quiet devastation happening in my kitchen. I thought about calling him. I thought about picking up the phone and asking why. But I already knew why. Garrett had always been good at wanting things. Even as a boy, he'd had that look in his eyes, the one that calculated what something was worth before deciding if it mattered to him. His father used to say it was ambition. I used to think it was just stubbornness. But now, holding this petition in my hands, I realized it was something else entirely. Greed. Not the kind that announces itself. Not the loud, obvious kind that robs banks or cheats at cards. No, this was the quiet kind. The kind that justifies itself. The kind that says, I deserve this, and believes it. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Then I made myself a cup of tea. Lipton, the cheap kind, because I'd long since learned not to waste money on things that didn't matter. And sat there, thinking. I wasn't surprised. That was the strangest part. I wasn't even angry, not really. Just tired. Tired of hoping he'd change. Tired of making excuses for him. Tired of being the mother who kept the door open, kept the light on, kept believing that one day he'd walk back in and be the boy I remembered. But that boy was gone. Maybe he'd never existed at all. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later. I didn't hire a lawyer. Couldn't afford one anyway. But I did something else. I went to St. Cecilia's, the parish church on Belvedere Street, where I'd been going to Mass since I moved to the neighborhood. It was a beautiful old building, built in the 1890s, with stained glass windows that turned the light into something holy. I liked to sit in the back pew, where it was quiet, where I could think. Father Brennan found me there one afternoon. He was an older man, maybe 70, with white hair and a soft Irish brogue that reminded me of my own father. He slid into the pew beside me without saying anything, just sat there in the silence, the way good priests do. You look troubled, Margaret, he said finally. I didn't know where to start, so I just handed him the petition. He read it slowly, his face unreadable. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back. Your son, he said, not a question. My son. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, do you remember the story of the prodigal son? I nodded. Everyone knows that one. Do you remember what the father did when the son came back? He forgave him. He did, Father Brennan said. But do you remember what the son did first? I thought about it. He came back. Aye, he came back. He acknowledged what he'd done. He asked for forgiveness. The priest looked at me, his blue eyes gentle but firm. Your son hasn't done that, Margaret, and you can't forgive someone who isn't sorry. I felt something loosen in my chest, something I'd been holding tight for years. What do I do? I asked. You tell the truth, he said simply, and you let go of what you can't control. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing, not for battle. I wasn't going to fight Garrett, not really, but for peace. I went through every box in my apartment, every drawer, every corner. I found old photos of him as a boy, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a fish he'd caught on a camping trip to the Berkshires. I found report cards, birthday cards I'd saved, a Mother's Day card he'd made in 3rd grade that said, "You're the best mom," in wobbly crayon letters. I cried over those things. I let myself cry, because I knew I needed to. And then I put them in a box, taped it shut, and placed it on the top shelf of my closet. I wasn't throwing him away. I was just putting him down. The weight of him, the hope of him, the version of him I'd been carrying all these years. On the morning of the hearing, I woke up early. I made myself breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy. And I got dressed carefully. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for my cousin's funeral 2 years ago. I put on the small gold cross my mother had given me when I turned 16. I brushed my hair and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked old. That was the truth of it. 68 years old, with lines around my eyes and gray streaking through my auburn hair. My hands were spotted with age, my knuckles swollen from arthritis. But my eyes were clear, sharp. I wasn't confused. I wasn't helpless. I was just done. The courthouse was on Pemberton Square, a gray stone building that looked like it had been there since the beginning of time. I took the subway, the Orange Line to Downtown Crossing, then walked the rest of the way and arrived 15 minutes early. I sat on a bench outside the courtroom and watched people come and go. Lawyers in sharp suits, families huddled together, a young woman crying into a tissue. Then I saw him. Garrett came through the main doors flanked by his lawyer, a tall man with slick-back hair and a briefcase that probably cost more than my rent. Garrett wore a charcoal suit I didn't recognize, his hair neatly trimmed, his jaw set with confidence. He looked successful. He looked like someone who had his life together. He looked like a stranger. Our eyes met for just a second. I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe. Or guilt. But then it was gone, replaced by that hard, distant look I'd come to know so well. He didn't say hello, didn't nod, just walked past me like I wasn't there. And that, more than anything in that petition, told me everything I needed to know. The bailiff called us in. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal, with an American flag in the corner and a clock on the wall that ticked too loudly. Judge Callahan entered, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back tight, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that looked like they'd seen every lie ever told. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked at the papers in front of her. "This is a guardianship petition filed by Garrett Doyle concerning his mother, Margaret Doyle," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Mr. Doyle, you're represented by counsel. Mrs. Doyle, do you have representation?" I stood. My knees ached, but I stood straight. "No, Your Honor. I'm representing myself." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Very well. Mr. Keller, you may proceed." Garrett's lawyer stood and launched into his case. He spoke smoothly, confidently, laying out the evidence of my supposed incompetence. He cited the medical reports, the evaluations, the witness statements. He painted a picture of a confused, fragile old woman who couldn't be trusted to manage her own life. I sat there and listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't object. I just let him talk, because I knew what was coming. Judge Callahan read through the documents, her frown deepening with each page. Finally, she set them down and looked at Garrett. "Mr. Doyle," she said slowly, "you're asking for control of your mother's assets. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Garrett said, his voice smooth. "For her own protection." "I see." She picked up another sheet of paper. "And according to the financial disclosure filed with this petition, what assets does your mother currently have?" Garrett hesitated, just for a second, but I saw it. She has the house in South Boston, some savings, investments." "No," Judge Callahan interrupted. "She doesn't." The room went silent. "According to the records provided," the judge continued, her voice hard, "Mrs. Doyle sold her property 3 years ago. She has no significant bank accounts, no investments, no valuable assets. She rents an apartment in Dorchester and lives on Social Security. So, I'll ask you again, Mr. Doyle, what exactly are you trying to control?" Garrett's face went white. His lawyer shuffled papers, whispering urgently, but Garrett just stared at the judge, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That's when I stood. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and clear. "May I speak?" Judge Callahan nodded. "Go ahead, Mrs. Doyle." I took a breath. My heart was pounding, but my voice didn't shake. Maybe it was grace. Maybe it was just exhaustion. But I felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Your Honor," I began, "my son is right about one thing. I did have assets. I had a house, a 3-bedroom colonial in South Boston that my husband and I bought in 1987. After he died, I kept it. I raised Garrett there. I worked 2 jobs to keep the mortgage paid. That house was everything to me. I could feel Garrett staring at me, but I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the judge. 3 years ago, I started noticing changes in my son. He'd come by more often, but not to visit. He'd ask questions about the house, about my finances, about what I had set aside. At first, I thought he was just concerned. But then I saw the way he looked at things, the way he'd walk through rooms like he was appraising them, the way he talked about what the house would be worth if I ever sold it. Judge Callahan leaned forward slightly. Go on. I realized he was waiting for me to die, I said simply. Or worse, waiting for me to become helpless so he could take control. So I made a decision. I sold the house. I closed out my savings accounts, and I gave it away. The courtroom erupted. Garrett shot to his feet. She's insane! Your Honor, this proves exactly what we've been saying. Sit down, Mr. Doyle, Judge Callahan said sharply. Mrs. Doyle, to whom did you give this money? To St. Mary's Home for the Elderly, I said. To the Greater Boston Food Bank. To families in my parish who were struggling with medical bills and rent. I kept enough to live on. Enough for my apartment, my groceries, my medications. Nothing more. Garrett's lawyer was on his feet now. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is clearly evidence of diminished capacity. No rational person would what? Judge Callahan interrupted, her voice like ice. Would choose to give her money away rather than leave it to a son who's trying to declare her incompetent. That sounds perfectly rational to me. I saw the lawyer's jaw tighten. He sat down. The judge looked at me. Mrs. Doyle, do you have documentation of these transactions? I do, Your Honor. I reached into my purse, an old leather bag I'd had for 20 years, and pulled out a folder. Inside were bank statements, receipts, letters from the organizations I donated to. I'd kept everything, organized it carefully, because I'd known this day would come. The bailiff took the folder and handed it to the judge. She read through it slowly, methodically. The only sound in the courtroom was the ticking of that damn clock and the rustling of paper. Finally, Judge Callahan looked up. Her expression was unreadable. Mr. Doyle, she said, did you know your mother had disposed of her assets before filing this petition? Garrett's face was red now. No, she never told me. So you filed a guardianship petition to gain control of assets you assumed existed without actually verifying that they did? I was told. My sources said. Your sources? The judge's eyebrow arched. Who are these sources, Mr. Doyle? Garrett looked at his lawyer, who was suddenly very interested in his briefcase. Neighbors. People who knew her. They said she was acting strangely, that she wasn't taking care of herself. Names, please. I don't have them with me. Judge Callahan set the folder down with a deliberate thud. Let me see if I understand this correctly. You filed a petition claiming your mother is incompetent, backed by medical evaluations from doctors she's never seen, witness statements from people you can't name, all in an attempt to gain control of assets that no longer exist. Is that accurate? The silence was deafening. Your Honor, the lawyer tried. My client was acting in good faith, believing his mother needed protection. Good faith? The judge's voice could have cut steel. Mr. Keller, I've been on this bench for 17 years. I know what good faith looks like. And this isn't it. She turned to me. Mrs. Doyle, I'm going to ask you some questions. Answer honestly. Yes, Your Honor. What year is it? 2025. Who is the President of the United States? I told her. What did you have for breakfast this morning? Scrambled eggs and toast. Can you tell me your address? I recited it perfectly. Judge Callahan nodded. And why did you give away your money, Mrs. Doyle? In your own words. I took a breath. This was the moment, the real moment. Because I realized something, Your Honor. My son doesn't love me. Maybe he did once when he was small, before his father died, and the world got hard. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being his mother and started being an asset, something to be managed, something to be controlled, and eventually, something to be liquidated. My voice cracked, just a little, but I pushed through. I spent years making excuses for him, telling myself he was just going through a rough patch, that he'd come around, that he was still the boy I raised. But he's not. He's a man who looks at his own mother and sees dollar signs, who fabricates medical records to have her declared incompetent, who walks into a courtroom with a smile because he thinks he's already won. I finally looked at Garrett, really looked at him. His face was twisted with rage and humiliation, but underneath I saw something else, something small and wounded and desperate. I gave the money away because I wanted to be free, I said quietly. Free from his expectations, free from his calculations, free from waiting for him to become someone he was never going to be. I gave it away so that when I die, and I will, eventually, like everyone does, he won't have anything to fight over. He won't have anything to regret, except the time he wasted treating me like a bank account instead of a human being. A tear rolled down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. And maybe, I continued, just maybe, by giving that money to people who actually needed it, I did something good, something that mattered, something that would make my husband proud, something that would make God, if he's listening, see that I tried, that I didn't just take up space in this world, that I left it a little better than I found it. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the clock seemed to have stopped ticking. Judge Callahan looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Garrett. "Mr. Doyle," she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "I'm dismissing this petition. Your mother is clearly competent. More competent, I'd argue, than many people half her age. She made a choice about her own assets. A choice that was entirely within her rights to make. You don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it. But you do have to accept it." She paused, then added, "And if I were you, I'd spend some time thinking about why your mother felt she needed to protect herself from you." Garrett stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is bullshit," he hissed. "She's manipulating everyone, can't you see that? She's a bitter old woman who—" "Mr. Doyle," Judge Callahan said, her voice like thunder. "One more word, and I'll hold you in contempt. Now sit down, or leave my courtroom." For a second, I thought he might keep going. I thought he might explode right there, say everything he'd been holding back for years. But then his lawyer grabbed his arm and whispered something urgent, and Garrett went pale. He turned and walked out. No goodbye, no apology, just gone. His lawyer stayed behind long enough to gather his papers, mumbling something about appealing the decision. But Judge Callahan shut that down immediately. "There's nothing to appeal, Mr. Keller. This case is closed. And I suggest you advise your client to move on before he finds himself facing sanctions for filing a frivolous petition." The lawyer left. And then it was just me, standing in that courtroom, with the judge looking at me with something that might have been respect. "Mrs. Doyle," she said, "do you need anything? Resources, counseling, assistance?" "No, Your Honor," I said. "I'm fine." "Are you sure? Because what you just described, that's elder abuse, financial exploitation. If you want to press charges, I don't," I said firmly. "I don't want to punish him. I just want to live the rest of my life in peace." Judge Callahan studied me. Then she nodded. "All right, but if you change your mind, my clerk can provide you with resources. You deserve better than this." "Thank you, Your Honor." She dismissed me, and I walked out of that courtroom with my head high and my heart lighter. Not happy, exactly, but lighter. Outside, the March air hit me like a slap. It was colder than when I'd gone in, and the sky had turned that particular shade of gray that promised rain. I stood on the courthouse steps, pulling my coat tighter around me, and looked out at the city. Boston stretched out in every direction, old and new, elegant and gritty, full of history and possibility. Somewhere out there, Garrett was probably in a bar, drowning his humiliation in whiskey and blame. Somewhere out there, families were sitting down to dinner, children were doing homework, people were falling in love and falling apart and just trying to get through another day. And somewhere out there, at St. Mary's Home for the Elderly, a woman I'd never met was sleeping in a warm bed because my money had helped keep the heat on. At the food bank, a family was picking up groceries because my donation had stocked the shelves. In my parish, a young mother was able to pay her electric bill because I'd helped. That's what I'd bought with my house, with my savings, with everything I'd worked for. Not control, not security, not even peace, really. But grace, the kind of grace that comes from letting go, from trusting that sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do, from believing that mercy matters more than vengeance, even when vengeance feels justified. I started walking. Not back to the subway. Not yet. I just needed to move, to feel my legs carry me through the city, to remind myself that I was still here, still alive, still capable of choosing my own path. I walked past the old State House, past Faneuil Hall, past tourists taking photos, and street performers playing violin. I walked until I found myself at the edge of the public garden, where the swan boats sit empty in winter, and the trees are just starting to bud with the promise of spring. I sat on a bench and watched people pass by. An elderly couple holding hands, a young mother pushing a stroller, a man in a suit talking urgently on his phone. All of them carrying their own stories, their own burdens, their own versions of grace and struggle. I thought about Garrett as a boy. I thought about the day he was born, how small he'd been, how he'd gripped my finger with his tiny hand, like he'd never let go. I thought about teaching him to ride a bike, about bandaging his scraped knees, about the way he'd run to me when he had nightmares. I thought about his father's funeral, how Garrett had stood there, 12 years old and trying not to cry, and how I'd promised him we'd be okay. We hadn't been okay, not really, but we'd survived. And now, sitting on this bench in the cold March air, I realized something. I'd done my best. I hadn't been a perfect mother. No one is. But I'd loved him fiercely and raised him with everything I had. What he chose to do with that, who he chose to become, wasn't my responsibility anymore. I'd carried him for long enough. It was time to put him down. A light rain started to fall. I stood, adjusted my purse, and headed toward the subway. My apartment was waiting, small and modest and mine. Tomorrow I'd wake up and make breakfast and maybe go to Mass. I'd water the plant on my windowsill and call Mrs. Nguyen to see if she needed anything from the store. I'd live my life, quietly and simply, without the weight of my son's expectations pressing down on me. And if he ever came back, if he ever knocked on my door with genuine remorse, with real change in his heart, I'd forgive him. Not because he deserved it, but because that's what mothers do. That's what grace looks like. But I wouldn't wait for it. I wouldn't hold my breath or keep the light on or check my phone every hour hoping for a call. I was done waiting. I was finally, beautifully, devastatingly free. The days after the hearing passed slowly, like wading through deep water. I thought I'd feel triumphant. I thought I'd wake up the morning after and feel vindicated, righteous, free in the way I'd imagined during all those sleepless nights when I'd planned what I'd say, how I'd stand, what I'd do when the moment came. But instead I just felt tired, hollowed out, like I'd won a battle but lost something I couldn't quite name. I went through the motions. I made my tea in the morning. Lipton, 2 sugars, a splash of milk. and I ate my toast standing by the window, watching Dorchester Avenue wake up below. The restaurant smells drifted up as always, garlic and ginger and something sharp and bright that I'd never learned the name for. Mrs. Nguyen waved to me from the sidewalk one morning, her arms full of grocery bags, and I waved back. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it had been, except it wasn't, because now I knew, with absolute certainty, that my son was never coming back. Not the way I'd hoped, not with apologies or regret or any of the things I'd secretly wished for in the deepest, most foolish part of my heart. He'd made his choice in that courtroom. He'd walked out without looking back, and that told me everything I needed to know. I'd spent 40 years being his mother, and in one afternoon, I'd become a stranger to him. The worst part was, I still loved him. That's what nobody tells you about love. It doesn't stop just because the person doesn't deserve it anymore. It doesn't turn off like a faucet or fade like old photographs. It just sits there, heavy and stubborn, reminding you of everything you've lost. A week after the hearing, Father Brennan came to visit. I heard his knock. 3 soft raps, polite and patient. And I knew it was him before I even opened the door. He stood there in his black shirt and clerical collar, holding a covered dish that smelled like shepherd's pie. "I thought you might be hungry," he said. I wasn't, but I let him in anyway. We sat at my small kitchen table, the same one where I'd read Garrett's petition, and Father Brennan served us both. The shepherd's pie was still warm, made by one of the parish ladies who seemed to think cooking was a form of prayer. Maybe it was. I took a bite, and it was good. Rich and savory, and exactly the kind of comfort I didn't realize I needed. "You've been avoiding Mass," Father Brennan said gently. "I've been tired." "Tired?" he repeated. "Or hiding." I set my fork down. What would I be hiding from? Grief, maybe. Anger. The fact that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. I looked at him. This old Irish priest with his kind eyes and his too long nose and his habit of saying exactly what I didn't want to hear. "I thought I'd feel better," I admitted. I thought once it was over, once I'd said what I needed to say, I'd feel, I don't know, lighter, stronger, something. And instead I just feel sad. My voice cracked. I feel like I buried him, Father. Like I stood up in that courtroom and buried my own son. Father Brennan reached across the table and took my hand. His skin was papery and warm, spotted with age just like mine. "You didn't bury him, Margaret," he said quietly. "You let him go. There's a difference. Is there? Burying someone means they're dead, and there's no hope left. Letting go means you're releasing them to find their own way, and maybe, someday, find their way back. But you're not holding on to them anymore. You're not carrying the weight of who they should be." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. "What if he never comes back?" "Then he doesn't," Father Brennan said simply. "And you'll still be all right, because you already know how to live without him. You've been doing it for years." He was right, of course. Garrett had been absent long before that courtroom. He'd been gone for birthdays and Christmases, gone for the nights when I'd gotten sick and had no one to call, gone for all the small, ordinary moments that make up a life. I'd been alone for a long time. I just hadn't admitted it. "The hardest part of faith," Father Brennan continued, "is trusting that God sees what we can't, that he knows the ending of the story when we're still stuck in the middle chapters. You did what you had to do, Margaret. You protected yourself. You chose mercy over bitterness. And now you have to trust that it was enough." "What if it wasn't?" "Then it still is," he said. "Because mercy isn't about results. It's about who you choose to be when someone hurts you. And you chose grace." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the city, sirens in the distance, someone's television murmuring through the walls, the occasional rattle of the radiator. I thought about everything Father Brennan had said. I thought about grace and mercy and all those big, impossible words that were supposed to make suffering make sense. And then I thought about my husband. Patrick had been gone for 28 years, but I still remembered him clearly. The way he laughed, loud and unself-conscious. The way he'd kissed my forehead before leaving for work every morning. The way he'd taught Garrett to throw a baseball, patient and encouraging even when the ball went wild and broke the kitchen window. Patrick would have been heartbroken by what Garrett had become, but he also would have forgiven him, probably faster than I had. He'd always been the softer one, the one who believed people could change, who gave second and third and fourth chances. I wondered what he'd say to me now. Probably something simple and true, the way he always did. Something like, "You did your best, Maggie. Now rest." So I tried. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, in and out, the way the doctor had taught me when my anxiety got bad after Patrick died. And eventually, somewhere between waking and sleeping, I felt something shift. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. The kind that comes when you stop fighting what is and start living with it. Spring came slowly to Boston, the way it always does. The snow melted into gray slush, then into puddles, then finally disappeared altogether. The trees in the public garden started to bud. The swan boats came out of storage. People shed their heavy coats and walked a little faster, a little lighter, like the return of the sun had given them permission to hope again. I started going back to Mass. Not every Sunday. I wasn't that consistent, but most of them. I'd sit in my usual pew in the back and listen to Father Brennan's homilies, which were always too long, but always said something worth hearing. I'd take communion and let the wafer dissolve on my tongue and feel for just a moment like I was part of something bigger than myself. One Sunday in late April, after Mass, a woman approached me. She was younger, maybe in her 50s, with dark hair streaked with gray and a warm, open face. "Mrs. Doyle?" she said tentatively. "Yes? I'm Linda Morrison. I don't know if you remember me, but..." She paused, gathering her words. "You donated money to my family last year, when my husband was sick and we couldn't pay the medical bills. Father Brennan told me it came from you." I remembered. A man with cancer, a wife trying to work 2 jobs and care for him at the same time, 2 teenage daughters who looked scared and exhausted. I'd given them $5,000, money I'd set aside from the house sale, earmarked for people who needed it more than I did. "I remember," I said. Linda's eyes filled with tears. "My husband died 3 months ago, but because of you, he died at home, with us, instead of in some hospital bed we couldn't afford. Because of you, I didn't lose our house. Because of you, my daughters didn't have to drop out of school." She reached out and took my hands, gripping them tightly. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "I don't know what you sacrificed to help us, but I want you to know it mattered. You saved us, Mrs. Doyle. You saved my family." I couldn't speak. I just stood there, holding her hands, feeling the weight of her gratitude like a physical thing. "I'm so sorry about your husband," I finally managed. "Me too," she said. "But I'm grateful we had the time we did, and that's because of you." She hugged me then, a real hug, tight and genuine. And when she pulled away, I saw that other people were watching. People I recognized from the parish, people I'd helped without ever knowing their names or seeing their faces. They nodded at me. Some smiled. One older gentleman tipped his hat. I'd thought I'd given everything away to keep it from Garrett, and maybe that was part of it. But standing there in that church, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by my choices, I realized I'd done something else too. I'd planted seeds, small, quiet seeds that had grown into something I'd never see the full harvest of. But they were there, growing, making a difference. And maybe that was enough. Summer arrived hot and humid, turning Boston into a sauna. I spent my days simply. I walked to the library and borrowed books I'd always meant to read. I volunteered at the food bank on Thursday afternoons, sorting donations and chatting with the other volunteers, mostly retirees like me who just wanted to feel useful. I had coffee with Mrs. Nguyen and learned to make spring rolls in her tiny kitchen, laughing when I botched the folding, and she patiently showed me again. I lived small. I lived quietly, but I lived fully, in a way I hadn't in years. And then, in late July, Garrett called. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved in my phone, but I recognized the area code. Newton, where he lived with Vanessa in a house they'd bought right before the last business venture collapsed. I stared at the screen, watching it ring, my heart doing something complicated and painful in my chest. On the 5th ring, I answered. "Hello?" Silence. Then, "Mom?" His voice was different, smaller, less certain. "Yes, Garrett." More silence. I could hear him breathing, hear the hesitation, the struggle. He stopped, started again. "I wanted to call and say, I wanted to tell you." I waited. I didn't help him. I didn't make it easier. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry for what I did, for the petition, for the lies, for all of it. I was angry and desperate, and I convinced myself that you owed me something, that I deserved." His voice broke. "I'm just sorry, Mom. I'm so fucking sorry." I closed my eyes. 100 responses ran through my mind. Anger, bitterness, questions about why it took him 4 months to call, why he thought that a simple apology could erase what he'd done. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was simple. "I forgive you." I heard him exhale, shaky and relieved. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said quickly. "I don't expect anything. I needed you to know. And I'm getting help. Therapy. Vanessa and I are separated, and I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be someone I'm not. That's good, Garrett. Can I..." He paused. "Can I see you sometime? Just coffee or something. No expectations, I miss you, Mom." I looked around my small apartment, at the plant on the windowsill, at the photo of Patrick on the dresser, at the life I'd built without him. "Not yet," I said gently. "Maybe someday, but not yet." "Okay." His voice was thick. "Okay, I understand." "Garrett?" "Yeah, I love you. I always have. But love doesn't mean I have to let you hurt me again." "I know," he whispered. "I know." We said goodbye. I hung up and sat there for a long time, holding the phone, feeling something shift in my chest. Not healing. Healing takes longer than a phone call. But maybe the beginning of it. The first tentative stitch. As summer turned to fall, I found myself thinking less about what I'd lost and more about what I'd gained. Peace, yes, but also clarity. The ability to wake up in the morning and not wonder what Garrett wanted from me. Not calculate how to protect myself. Not carry the weight of his expectations. I'd given away my house, my savings, everything I'd worked for. And in return, I'd gotten my life back. One October morning, exactly 7 months after the hearing, I walked to St. Cecilia's. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Inside, the church was quiet and empty, the way I liked it. I sat in my usual pew and looked up at the stained glass windows, at the light filtering through in reds and blues and golds. I thought about grace, real grace, not the pretty version we talk about in Sunday school, the kind that costs something, the kind that requires you to let go of what's fair and choose what's right instead. I thought about my son, somewhere out there, trying to become better, and I hoped he would. I prayed he would, but I wasn't waiting for it anymore. I thought about Patrick and how proud he'd be, not of the courtroom drama or the clever way I'd outmaneuvered Garrett, but of the fact that I'd chosen mercy, that I'd chosen to give rather than hoard, that I'd trusted, even when trust felt impossible. And I thought about myself, 68 years old, living in a one-bedroom walk-up above a Vietnamese restaurant, with nothing of value except the clothes in my closet and the peace in my heart. I'd spent my whole life building things. A home, a family, a future, and I'd watched it all crumble or be taken or simply fade away. But in the ashes, I'd found something unexpected. Freedom. Not the kind that comes from having options or money or control, but the kind that comes from letting go, from trusting that you'll be okay even when everything falls apart, from believing that grace, given and received, is the only currency that really matters. I stayed in that church for a long time, sitting in the colored light, feeling the presence of something bigger than myself. God, maybe. Or just the weight of all the choices I'd made, all the roads I'd walked, all the love I'd given and lost and given again. When I finally stood to leave, my knees ached and my back was stiff, but my heart felt lighter than it had in years. I walked out into the October sunshine, pulled my coat a little tighter, and headed home. Tomorrow I'd wake up and make breakfast and maybe call Linda Morrison to see how her daughters were doing in college. I'd water my plant and read my library book and live my small, ordinary, beautiful life. And if Garrett called again, I'd answer. Because that's what mercy looks like. Leaving the door unlocked, even when you're not sure anyone will walk through it. But I wouldn't wait by it. I wouldn't put my life on hold. I'd already spent too many years doing that. Now, finally, I was free. And free, I discovered, was enough. You're asking for the assets to go in your name, but your mother doesn't have anything in her name, the judge said, leaving him in shock. My son walked into the hearing laughing mockingly, certain he'd claim I was senile. But when the judge said, "You're asking for the assets to be transferred to your name, yet your mother doesn't own anything in her name," he was left in shock.